So right now we will transition perfectly on time into the Q&A session. So I'd like to invite back Vimla to join Rubia and Carol, and I just want to double check in the chat. Okay, I'm assuming the Danish team will not be joining. So yeah, let's start. So before we get started, I do want to say, if you have questions, please do feel free to post them in the Q&A. So we'll go through as many as we can. And I'd like to start with one in particular. So you'd mentioned Colin Kaepernick, and he had this protest, and then immediately after he had a hard time getting hired in the NFL. And I think that this idea of getting negative consequences for kind of standing up, it's going to happen until kind of challenging the status quo, until different versions of culture and dissent are more of the norm. We're inevitably going to have that. So my question is, how can we help each other, knowing that this is true, knowing there might be consequences to speaking up? What can we do for each other to really elevate ourselves as a whole?
I'm happy to jump in there. So it's really interesting you bring that up, because my mum still says to me, don't make a fuss, don't call it out, just sit back and stay quiet, because that's the kind of fear culture that existed in her generation, to accepting a lot of the microaggressions or racism that she faced. And I think there's a really huge amount of power now that exists in the voice that we have as first generation immigrants to not accept that anymore. And allyship becomes really important. So finding the allies and the people in power who can open those doors or have our backs in the ways that we want to call it out or feel comfortable doing so, but also starting to normalize those conversations so that we can have a fair and equitable voice in the room and around decision-making tables. Because as soon as we start normalizing the things that aren't all right or aren't correct in the systems and in power dynamics, we can start to see effective change take place.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's also about just like knowing that we're on this massive wave of opportunity for change as well. People are on this journey with us right now. I'm not sure we would have presented that talk 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even a year ago. I think 2020 is a really interesting year, and people are really awakening to this as a mass kind of movement, rather than it coming from just one specific community.
Yeah.
I also think as a small build, part of it is actually thinking about your role, and particularly I sort of do this all the time, thinking about my role in a leadership context. It's actually about, how do you leave the ladder down? How do you help others also climb up? Because it's hard, right? It really is hard. And there's not necessarily kind of a straightforward, starter for 10 way to do it, but being really cognizant of that. How do you bring people into the conversation? How do you, from a facilitation perspective, make sure all voices are included, whether it's through individual ideation versus, for example, group discussions? Again, it's just being cognizant of your role and your ability to help amplify those who might need just a little bit of a step up.
Yeah. I love that. We really are in this together, and I will second that. I think 2020 is a little bit of a blessing in disguise, in that some of these conversations are indeed safer to have, and that's really the first step. So how do you manage this dissent with internal stakeholders, dissent and pushes for culture change?
So I think I'll kick off, but I think Rubia, everyone else will definitely have some views. I think part of it, there's a couple of things, right? Sometimes you have to pick your battle. Sometimes you do know that you're not going to win that battle. So, and Rubia and I have talked about this a lot. Sometimes you just have to focus on the areas that you think you are going to be able to make the most impact. And that's also hard, because naturally all of us want to be involved in a number of things. The flip side of that, however, and we see this in our day-to-day lives, is actually spending some time understanding who those stakeholders are, what are their drivers, and then us as communicators and storytellers, how do we then reframe something, whether it's somebody's story, a user need, or a driver for change, in a way that resonates with that person. So for example, if I was to speak to a CFO, I don't necessarily talk about user stories in a how does this make my user feel. I talk about, actually, if we transform this part of the process, this is going to drive, reduce your baseline costs by X, Y, and Z, in a way that kind of resonates with them. And it's hard because sometimes you do kind of want to have everyone in the boat, but at the same time, you do have to realize that everybody else is at different stages of their design journey, understanding design as part of the business vernacular or wider stakeholder vernacular, but also everybody is coming at the problem from a different perspective.
Yeah, and to build on that, actually, probably just to reiterate the point a little bit is, one of the things I say to most of the designers that I mentor is, I think the biggest gap in the design vernacular itself is the ability to build a business case around design-led change. And so I think one of the key things in organizational change, culture design, etc., is the ability to prove it through the return on investment or the business case around it. And there's heaps and heaps of data and analysis that already exists for around the profitability and business logic around diversity and inclusion in the workplace. It's applying that to the individual business cases that we're building around the services, products, or organizational change that we're trying to implement and do.
Yeah, I mean, you've both said it perfectly. I think if there were two things I would add to that. One is a point that I made in our presentation, which is really empowering those around you. The more that we do challenge the status quo and dissent, the more that we're encouraging the people around us to do the same, regardless of seniority or anything like that. And I do think, kind of going back to Carol's point around storytelling as well, as designers, we're taught to empathize, and ultimately we're designing for humans, and CFOs are humans too. So if we can articulate that empathy in a really good way so that they then come on that journey with us, it's not only having that business case of solid figures, you'll then get CFOs saying, CX and human-centered design is important because, because it does help me in my bottom line, but they start to consider more of a triple bottom line rather than just a financial bottom line.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good point. And funny enough, we got a question that I think comes up often, and I guess in all spaces, but it's this idea that design is becoming more and more of a strategic conversation, and it's going from kind of making things look good or having some of the smaller changes. Do you have any examples or any kind of favorite stories of how of kind of having design as part of a bigger conversation, having been able to build it into more of like a seat at the table, and any examples of how you might have done that?
I'm happy to jump in there. So almost every day. So part of the way that we operate is to build design into the strategy. So whether it's business model canvassing or thinking through the goals and metrics or factors that we're going to measure throughout the life expectancy of that business. Design sits at the core of all of it because it's the driver for the decisions that we make. So how we build and how might we questions into the business design is really fundamental. And we do that working with the public sector through to like big private companies or small startups. It's really bringing, I guess, the design narrative rather than the design practice. So using the tools and techniques that we would use in any design project, but a typical design project, and just transferring those into a business context without people really realizing. And for me, it's not about the recognition that it's design strategy or that it's doing design, it's just doing it through everyday use of tools and language and change.
I think my build on that would be, isn't that actually a great thing? Because we now have an opportunity to make an impact in a way that, for example, when I was at architecture school, I thought I was going to be designing cool buildings, and that was going to be really cool. But actually being able to design a new service, for example, I worked on disability benefits in Scotland last year, and that was an amazing project. Having worked on the visa and immigration system, for me, was also really impactful, because actually it was something that impacted me as a foreigner here. But I think the great thing about that is it's an amazing platform and an amazing opportunity. And I think part of the points that we raised were actually about, you have an accountability as a designer to deliver and design something for the future. And it's hard, like, don't get me wrong, it's some days you're like, I wish I could just render a cool building and be Zaha Hadid, the late Zaha Hadid. But other days, actually, when you get something amazing through that was really hard but impacts millions of people across the country that you live in, that's a pretty awesome feeling, even though it may have been very hard at the time.
So one of the audience questions that came in was actually geared towards Vimla's points about data, but I'd actually think that it's a little bit more of a broader conversation, so kind of speaks to all of the topics. But you know, you mentioned accountability, and I think in the context of, for example, data, what are some of the accountability checks and balances that can be put into place to allow biased data? And I'd maybe like to extend that to say, what are the accountability measures that can be put into place to allow also for this kind of culture of bringing up that there might be biases, or bringing up that things might not be working as intended?
I'm trying to rein in my thoughts so I don't go on a massive rant here. So I think there are three kind of points that really stick out in my mind. And the most radical of them is that business innovation doesn't need to be driven by capitalism anymore. We have an opportunity for grassroots innovation and data ethics and standards to lead the way in the way that we collect and use data to improve the technology that we're putting out into the world. Because when we see it driven by purely economic gains, we put it out with the huge gaps or the cut corners or a lean approach to data standards that just doesn't work for the people who are then disenfranchised or disempowered as a result. So I think it's up to us as designers to slow that down and really put those ethical practices into place. And there's so much work being done by data scientists out there on good data ethics and standards. So I'd look into that. Then the second point is trying to, as all of us have said, bring more voices into the room to understand who might be excluded from that product or service before it gets released. And that means testing it with more people, making sure that there's a consideration from who has been excluded in the process, and asking the challenging questions early on about what if this doesn't work? Who haven't we considered? What's the negative impact of long-term data collection in this space? And then the third is a rethink of the structures around the rewards given to data at a scientific level. So at the moment, we're not having to prove the data validation of the data that we're putting into PhDs. The ethical standard at the moment doesn't take into consideration gender, race, ability, any protected characteristics. And so there's, for me, a movement that's missing in bringing all of the social movements that we've seen over the last year, and to a larger extent 10 years, into the data ethics conversation, so that we start to challenge the data norms and the historical legacy data that's going into these systems now. So I think there's the kind of individual, how we give data to the systems and services, then there's the much more macro level of data at large and how we want to build best practice into that.
Very quick build. I think one of the things my teams always talk about and are reminded of is data is really important. It's really, really useful, but it doesn't often give you the root cause of things. We're often dealing with humans. Humans are really, really complex. And I think while data is really informative, really helps us build that business case and really helps us reinforce some of our research insights, for example, it does sometimes take away the complexity and the layers that you might get from designing for humans.
So with that with all of that in mind, have you seen anyone do that really, really well? Have you seen kind of any companies or individuals or industries that are doing it right that we can look to as inspiration?
And you'll have to forgive me for saying this, but not at the moment, no. I can't, no one springs to mind for an organisation that's leading the way. The only areas where I'd love for people to point me in the direction of cases where I can take inspiration from, but the only places where I've seen this is grassroots level open data initiatives. So being in Manchester, Open Data Manchester have a really great initiative of how to open source a lot of data collection and pulling from open APIs. But it's one of my personal and business ambitions to try and make it a norm in for-profit organisations that this is a consideration across the board. But yeah, I hope there are examples out there.
I don't have one around data collection, but you just made me think of really good transparency around data regulations and data communication, which I noticed with IKEA actually in their app. They've, and I think a lot of sort of, obviously human behaviors are very complex and it's hard to capture in data, but there's also an issue around trust and people not, maybe opting out a lot of the time, and especially millennials and Gen Z who are savvy enough to know what might happen to data. And I think what IKEA have done with their app is they've created like this really brilliant little sort of simplified graphics in order to communicate exactly what they're doing with your data. So, and they've also improved it so that you can opt in and opt out at different points of your interaction, and you know exactly what's happening with that data, what IKEA is doing with it, and then how they're tailoring things for you off the back of it. And I just thought that kind of transparency and communication was so brilliant in terms of improving trust, so that people are more willing to participate in data collection.
I think that's such a good example, what you said about having graphics or making it visual. I think that there's the one side of, sure, we'll share any information forever, but there really is that necessity for the extra step of, but we will make it accessible to you and make it make sense, because, it's kind of the equivalent of just reading the miles long pages of terms and conditions and something. I think that's not good enough. That doesn't quite count. And I mean, the fact that we can't just call upon a number of organizations, right? That there's just a whole universe in that. And I'm such a big fan of how do we collect more of those stories? Because I think maybe on a mass scale, they're not necessarily out there, but I think that they're kind of, maybe they're hidden, it might be a handful of people that are kind of speaking up, like that data analyst at Facebook who had this expose about how, Facebook was helping other countries kind of advance political agendas and things, and speaking out. So I think there are a ton of maybe little hidden stories, and I would encourage us to bring it out maybe as a community. How do we elevate that so that there is that example of doing good and someone can use it as inspiration? Let's see, do you ever have burnout, dissent burnout, challenge status quo burnout, advocate for culture burnout, and how do you deal with it?
Totally. Totally. So sometimes when I chat to people and you sort of have career frustration work chats, I sort of think about work sometimes as I'm pushing wheelbarrows of shit uphill. So people might be familiar with the term I'm pushing shit uphill. It's a grind, it's really hard. But I find sometimes at work, and it's become more evident to me working in the UK, that I'm pushing 3 wheelbarrows of shit uphill. I've got the I'm female in a predominantly male-dominated environment wheelbarrow of shit. I then have the I'm also not white wheelbarrow of shit that I'm also pushing up the hill. And then I've also got, particularly in the environments that I work in, I actually work in design, but in a business-oriented context, pushing wheelbarrow of shit uphill. And actually, it really is tiring. And the point we made in our talk about this is where your squad becomes really, really important. They're the people I go and have a wine with, a yarn with, a download, that therapeutic kind of chat. And then actually they're the people that see you at your worst, but they're the people that also know what you're great at and help rebuild you so that you can kind of jump back in there. It's not easy. There are some days I'm just like, no, it's a onesie day to day. And that's okay. Being vulnerable, taking a time out is okay. I think, but where we kind of need to remember our roles in society is actually we have the opportunity to really change stuff, and that's hard, but it's a great opportunity and we should do that justice.
Yeah. Yes. Is my answer to your question. It's so tiring sometimes. And I think, you know, we mentioned resilience, and, you know, as Carol said, having a good squad and community around you. I think even at the best of times, you know, you can really try and separate a difficult conversation at work from your home life. In the pandemic, that's even harder. What I found is actually this pandemic, and I haven't been in the office since March, has been a really good opportunity for me to actually take back some of my time and use that for things like mindfulness, like just digital detoxing a little bit. You know, Twitter I find can be really unhealthy, so switching that off sometimes. And you know, before I used to, you know, put headspace on if I was commuting or something like that, but I realized that I wasn't really taking it in. So I've tried a whole bunch of things lately in terms of and actually taking the time to really just, for me, to remind myself of what is important, and what my priorities are, that I think has been really healthy actually, during this time, because it's difficult. It's difficult being the black sheep in the room all the time. It's difficult constantly challenging people. It's difficult being told no all the time. And you know, I regularly come home and sort of tell my partner and my family, like, I just feel like I've been shat on today. You know, that is how I feel a lot of the time. But there's always a way to pick yourself up and look at the bigger picture. And it's those incremental changes that really give me hope.
And just to build on that a little bit, yes, completely agree with everything everyone has said, and I was nodding profusely throughout that. I think one of the biggest learnings I've had from being at the brink of burnout, like at the point where I couldn't get out of bed anymore, just because the pressure was just hounding on me every day of create change, like the world isn't good enough. Because it isn't, and it just isn't good enough, but there is hope everywhere. And one of the things that I find completely humbling and inspiring is recognizing that it doesn't have to be me. It doesn't have to be me that creates all of the change. And I think Carol said it earlier, you know, it's about sending the ladder back down. And that's so important in igniting the flames around us for the people who can also create change. Like, we don't have to take the burden on ourselves. It's about using our passion and fire in the most effective way to work with others to create change en masse. It's not on an individual level that it's going to happen, it's together in a collective. And that's just alleviated so much pressure on my shoulders to try and conquer the world on my own. And being more realistic about it. We're in this together, and as a design collective, as people in our squads and our teams and communities and networks, our families, we can do this together in small little changes to take on a much bigger picture.
That is all so beautiful. And to wrap up, I will end that by throwing out a challenge that I do with my community. So every once in a while, I'll kind of throw out a call to action and say, if you're ever feeling like you're crazy, you're not, call me and I will tell you that you're not alone in how you think, as as a designer, as a dissenter, or even as someone who lives in intersectionality of many different things. So I actually challenge you to maybe pay it forward and extend that ripple effect. Do that, throw out a call out to your community. You'd be surprised at just creating that safe space at how much of a massive impact it makes. And call me. This is my actual call out. I just say this every time I'm in a room full of designers. Find me at the Y Lab, Google me, find me somehow. Call me when you're feeling crazy, and I will tell you that you're not, because we really are in this together. Everyone, thank you so much for this wonderful and enriching discussion. I can't wait to follow along with more of your work and see how you take these ideas further.